The belt stopped with the same wet clap it made every time a shackle caught, except nothing had caught. No horn, no red light, no shout from the control desk. Just the chain going still, and the mechanical hum under line C dropping low enough for me to hear the other sound beneath it. A faint, damp rustling, like something dragging itself along metal where metal shouldn't have had any space to hold it. The air changed too. The section around me turned close and warm, humid enough to fog the inside of my face shield, even though the chillers were still blowing cold over the line. I could smell heated steel, bleach, and that sweet, rotten smell I'd been trying not to think about all night. The carcasses hanging in front of me had already gone through every stage that mattered: scalding, plucking, evisceration, chilling. What was left on those shackles should have been weight and skin and nothing else. Every one of them lifted its head, not a swing, not the line settling. They raised them slowly, together, as if something inside each hanging body had received the same signal at the same exact moment. Pale necks tilted. Empty faces turned toward me. The overhead lights dimmed just enough for me to see movement under the skin, little rearrangements, as if the things on the hooks were adjusting how they fit inside what had been processed around them. Something breathed under the conveyor. Then the line kicked back on. The hum swallowed the rustling. Every head dropped, every body went still. But the shackle right in front of me was empty. I remember touching the printed safety sheet in my pocket, soft from sweat and humidity, and thinking about the rule that said I had to report any stoppage in the conveyor system immediately. Why would a safety rule tell me to step closer to something trying to get off the line? It started a few hours before that. My first overnight shift at the plant began with cold air, wet concrete, and the smell of chicken fat baked into cinder block. By the time I reached the locker room, my clothes were already damp from the air inside the building. The plant sat in Independence County like any other industrial job site, boxy and floodlit, all flat walls and loading bays and a parking lot shining with old rain. Nothing about it looked hidden. Nothing about it looked unusual. If you'd driven past it at midnight, you would have thought exactly what I thought when I got hired. Long hours, bad smell, decent pay for the county. Inside, the hum never stopped. Fans, chains, compressors, water lines. Motors pushing the line through the same routine over and over until it got into your teeth. Under all that, though, there was another texture to the sound, something soft and irregular. I kept hearing it in the spaces between machines. A faint organic rustling. The kind of noise that made you turn your head even when you knew the room was full of moving equipment. Colton Rhea met me outside the inspection corridor with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a pair of ear protectors hanging around his neck. He didn't waste time trying to make the place sound better than it was. He had the flat voice of somebody who'd said the same thing too many times in bad air. He told me I was on line C. My job was simple. Watch each processed unit as it came by. Look for defects, irregular cuts, incomplete cleaning, anything that shouldn't make it past inspection. If I saw a problem, I tagged it. If the conveyor stopped, I reported it immediately. If anything happened at all, I stayed at my station until he told me otherwise. Then he handed me the printed safety sheet. The paper was laminated once. Years ago maybe, but the corners had split and the whole thing had gone soft from being handled with wet gloves. 3 rules were printed in block letters. Report any stoppage in the conveyor system immediately. Do not leave your assigned station under any circumstances. Inspect every unit that passes your station for irregularities. Colton tapped the last one with a thick finger. Every unit means every unit, he said. The way he said it stuck with me. It wasn't emphasis for quality control. It sounded closer to warning, except the warning wasn't for me. I nodded like I understood. I'd worked jobs with worse supervisors than him. Places where a man said one thing and meant 5. Keep up, don't complain, Don't get clever. Don't cost me time. I figured that was all this was. I didn't understand what I was hearing yet. Line C sat in one of the colder sections, though the cold there never felt clean. A mist hung over the moving line where chilled bodies came down the track, and every metal surface carried a film of moisture that never quite dried. My gloves squeaked when I rested my hand on the side panel beside my station. That's how I found the carving. At first I thought somebody had dragged a blade across the stainless steel out of boredom. Then I leaned close and read the words cut into the panel, each line deep enough to catch grime in the grooves. If the line stops on its own, do nothing. Never inspect anything that moves after processing. If you hear something breathing, it is not a sign to your station. I stared at the carving long enough for the cold off the line to sting through my sleeves. The letters were old, not fresh vandalism. The cuts had dark residue in them like they'd been there through washdowns and steam cleans and months of chemical spray. When I looked back over my shoulder, Colton Rhea was already walking away. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask what I was looking at. That bothered me more than the carving did. The line started moving. Shackles clinked. Cold bodies came drifting toward me under the lights, identical in shape at first glance, pale and wet and empty-eyed. I did what I was hired to do. I checked skin, joints, surface damage, stray feathering, anything obvious. My hands found the rhythm fast. Lift, turn, look, release, one after another. Only the air didn't keep the same rhythm. Some sections of the corridor felt properly refrigerated, then without warning a patch of warmth would roll through, damp and soft as breath, gone again by the time I looked for a vent problem. I told myself it was the machinery cycling unevenly. Old plant. Bad insulation. Heat bleed from another zone. That explanation lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then I passed the carved warning again with the side of my glove and realized the metal around those words was warmer than the rest of the panel. The first time the conveyor stopped, it happened so briefly I thought I'd imagined it. The chain gave a hard little shudder. The hooks jerked. The line went still. I turned toward the nearest alarm light, waiting for it to flash red. It stayed dark. No horn sounded. No voice came over the speaker. The only change was the silence left behind when the motion cut out. Not true silence, not in a plant like that. More like a layer had been peeled off the noise. Underneath the fans and distant water, I heard that low rustling again, closer now. Moving somewhere beneath the line, grating near my boots. My hand went straight to the radio clipped at my belt. Report any stoppage in the conveyor system immediately. I already had my thumb on the button when I remembered the carved warning. If the line stops on its own, do nothing. The stop couldn't have lasted more than 2 seconds, maybe 3. Long enough for cold mist to settle, long enough for the damp smell of sweet rot to rise stronger from the drain trough under the conveyor. Long enough for me to realize nobody else had reacted at all. Not Colton, not anyone farther down the corridor. I couldn't see faces clearly through shields and steam, but I could see posture, and nobody moved. Nobody reached for a radio, nobody turned. The whole line had frozen in place like people holding still during a lightning strike. Then the conveyor kicked back in and carried on as if nothing had happened. I stood there with my thumb resting on the radio switch and felt stupid in a way I hadn't in years. Like I'd almost raised my hand in class to ask a question everybody else already knew not to ask. When Colton came back up the corridor a few minutes later, I almost stopped him. The smell of bleach hit first, then cold water dripping off his apron. I opened my mouth and he looked at me once, just once, with a kind of tired expectation in his face. Not curiosity. Expectation. I said nothing. He kept walking. That was my first exposure to the fact that there were 2 sets of instructions in that building, and only one of them was written where management wanted you to see it. Jebediah Crowell showed up on Line C about an hour into the shift, set 2 stations down from me with the confidence of a man who'd never had a bad feeling last long enough to trust it. He was new too, first week like me, and still had the stiff cleanliness of somebody who hadn't yet gotten used to wearing the plant home on his skin. He checked his gloves, adjusted his face shield, and went at the line like he was trying to prove he'd be faster than everybody by the end of the night. He was the first person who spoke more than a sentence to me. "You see the scratched-up ghost stories on that panel?" he asked over the machinery. The smell down there had thickened, warm metal and wet feathers from somewhere farther back in the process, mixed with that sugary decay I couldn't place. I kept my eyes on the line. "Yeah," I said. Jebediah snorted. "People do anything on nights to mess with new hires." He said it like that settled it. There was comfort in how sure he sounded. I almost borrowed it. Almost. He'd bought into Colton's orientation completely. Stay sharp. Follow procedure. Don't get lax because somebody wants to spook you. Every time the line jittered or a hook squealed, Jebediah looked more offended than uneasy, like disorder was an insult to the rules he'd already memorized. The breathing started while he was talking. It was faint enough that at first I thought it was just his respirator shifting under the mask. Then it came again from somewhere under the conveyor frame near the floor, slow and damp and absolutely not mechanical. A drawn inhale, a pause, a softer exhale, the kind of breathing you heard from a large animal trying hard not to move. I held my own breath to catch it better. The sound stopped immediately. Jebediah noticed me listening and frowned. "You hear me?" I looked down through the grating at the black space under the line. Pipes, support beams, drainage, shadow. Nothing else. Cold air should have been collecting there, but the heat coming up through the slats felt body warm against my boots. "Yeah," I said. "I heard you." He shook his head and laughed once. "Why wouldn't they want us to follow safety rules?" That question lodged in me harder than I wanted it to. Because he was right, on its face. Nobody wrote safety procedures to make work more dangerous. Nobody carved better ones in secret unless the official set had failed somebody first. I wanted a simple answer. Old prank, bitter employees, plant superstition. Any ordinary explanation would have done. Instead, I glanced up and saw Colton Rhea at the end of the corridor, not watching the line, but watching us. The lights buzzed overhead. Condensation ticked from a pipe. Jebediah went back to work, fast and certain, and somewhere under our feet the rustling began again, so soft it rode inside the machinery like a second pulse. Looking back, that was the last stretch of the night when I still believed the rules were about punishment, not sorting. The twitch happened so small I almost missed it. By then my hands were numb in a useful way, moving on habit through cold skin and slick joints. The units came down the line at a pace that didn't leave room for second guessing. Check, release, check, release. Then one body passed under the light with a shiver in it. Not enough to swing the shackle, just a subtle tightening through the breast and neck like muscle responding to cold. I froze. The unit drifted another foot. The skin at the cut edge along the cavity pinched inward, then relaxed. Not machine vibration, not line chatter. Something answering itself from inside. Inspect every unit that passes your station for irregularities. The official rule rose in my head in Colton's flat voice. I stepped in close and caught the shackle to steady it. The metal was slick and colder than my glove. The body hanging from it wasn't. Through the chilled surface there was warmth held deep in the center, insulated and living. My stomach turned over once, hard. I pressed 2 fingers to the breastbone area, careful, professional, trying to confirm whether trapped motion from the conveyor had fooled me. Something pushed back. It wasn't a full strike. It was more deliberate than that. a pressure from inside the processed body pressing up into my hand at the exact point of contact, as if whatever occupied the cavity had been waiting for touch before deciding where I was. I snatched my hand away. The neck rolled toward me. A chicken carcass doesn't turn to look at you after processing. It has nothing left with which to decide direction. But that one rotated with a slow, damp certainty until the empty face pointed at my shield. I couldn't see eyes. There were no eyes to see. What I felt anyway was attention, pure and immediate. The air around my station went humid enough to taste. "See?" Jebediah called from down the line. "That's why they say inspect everything." I looked at him. He'd seen me lean in, seen the movement, and the only framework he had for it was that I'd found a defect. His face showed annoyance more than fear, as if I'd hesitated over routine work. Then he lowered his voice, just enough that it barely carried over the chains. Why wouldn't they want us to follow safety rules? He sounded less confident that time. Not because he believed the carving, not yet. Because he could tell from my face that something had happened my training sheet didn't cover. I didn't answer him because I didn't have one. The unit on the hook made a second movement. Smaller. Not toward me this time. Downward. The cavity flexed open a little wider and a thread of warm vapor slipped out into the cold air. It smelled sweet, spoiled, and oddly floral, like fruit left under heat lamps until it burst. I grabbed the reject tag on instinct. Before I could clip it, Colton Ria's hand closed around my wrist. I hadn't heard him approach. His glove was wet and strong and shaking just a little. "Let it pass," he said. That was all. Not inspect it better, not tag it, not call maintenance, just let it pass. He released my wrist and took one step back. The body moved down the line. The neck slowly settled forward again as it disappeared into the next temperature zone, where a curtain of mist swallowed it from view. Jebediah stared at Colton, then at me. "If it's irregular, we're supposed to mark it." Colton didn't look at him. "You're supposed to keep the line moving." There was no fear in his voice. That would have helped. Fear I could have understood. What he sounded like was a man correcting the wrong kind of mistake. That detail seemed minor at the time. I have thought about it every day since. After that, I stopped seeing the plant as one machine. Once your brain accepted that something living had answered my touch from inside a processed body, other patterns started surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. The line had always moved through zones with different temperatures, that much was standard. Hotter sections deeper in the facility where scalding happened. Colder sections where chilling locked product down. But on line C, where my station sat between cold mist and the next transfer point, some units only reacted after they'd crossed from one temperature band into another. Not all of them. That was the first important thing. Some came down the line dead in the simple, ordinary way I had expected from the start. Weight, skin, nothing more. Others carried a hidden timing inside them. A flex after cold, a tremor after warmth. A tightening only when condensation gathered on the surface and began to run. It wasn't random. It was environmental, triggered. The plant wasn't just processing material, it was changing conditions. The humid pockets I'd noticed earlier grew easier to track once I paid attention. They weren't drifting at random. They clustered around specific transfer points, especially where the line passed near waste chutes and drainage channels. In those places, the cold air of the inspection corridor thinned out for a second, and something body-warm rose under it, carrying that sugary rot smell with it. Heated metal, decay, moisture, the same combination every time. I started timing the reactions without meaning to, not out of courage, out of training. Once you do repetitive work long enough, pattern recognition takes over whether the pattern is welcome or not. One unit went by with a small, dark bruise near the wing joint and a split in the skin along the lower breast. I noticed it because the split had been stitched by the processing tie in a crooked way, distinctive enough to catch the eye. I watched it disappear through the mist toward the transfer bend. Less than 10 minutes later, the same unit passed my station again. Same bruise, same crooked tie, same tiny flap of skin at the edge of the cut, lifting in the airflow like a tongue. I felt the cold go thin inside my gloves. Lines looped through multiple sections, sure. Product got rerouted. I knew that, but not that fast and not back to me from a direction that should have sent it farther down toward packaging. For it to appear twice, something below my station had to be feeding selected units back into the stream. Not all of them. Selected. I looked down through the moving hooks and saw a narrow seam in the floor panel beneath Line C, half hidden by runoff and shadow. Each time a unit with one of those subtle post-processing reactions passed over it, the rustling underneath thickened. Not random movement. Anticipation. The layout of the place changed in my head right then. Scalding, chilling, inspection, waste, transfer. Those weren't just industrial stages, they were conditions, filters. Pressure changes inside a larger biological routine built into the machinery so thoroughly it had become invisible. The plant wasn't sitting on top of a hidden ecosystem. It was one of its organs. I kept working because stopping would have meant admitting I understood enough to be trapped by it. The smell turned sweeter as the hours dragged on. My shield kept fogging at the edges. Every few minutes I had to wipe my glove across it and pretend I was only clearing condensation, not checking whether something on a hook was trying to turn back toward me again. Jebediah Crowell noticed my silence and mistook it for being rattled by the workload. He grinned at me through the haze and lifted a passing unit by one leg to show how fast he was getting. "Once you stop overthinking it, it gets easy," he shouted. Behind him, one of the hanging bodies made a tiny swallowing movement in the throat. He didn't see it. The second major stoppage came with Jebediah's voice attached to it. By then, the line had given 2 more of those short, self-correcting halts, both so brief I could only feel them more than see them. Each time, nobody reacted except me. Each time I remembered the carved warning and forced myself to stay still. Jebediah noticed that too. The more I hesitated, the more convinced he became that I was letting superstition get into my head. So when the line bucked hard and stopped long enough for the hooks to swing out of alignment, Jebediah did what the orientation sheet told him to do. He hit his radio and called it in. "Line C stoppage," he barked. "Line C is down." The response was immediate in a way the earlier stops had not been. Overhead, white maintenance lights snapped on so bright they flattened every shadow. The conveyor motors wound down fully. Fans cut to a lower speed. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a series of locks engaged with heavy metallic thunks that I felt through the soles of my boots. Then the whole plant went unnaturally quiet. Not silent. Worse than silent. Controlled. With the line dead and the machinery idling low, all the ordinary industrial noise fell away and left a clean, exposed stillness that felt arranged, like a room after an argument when everyone has chosen not to speak. Water dripped from hooks. Condensation slid down the panels. The smell changed too. Less bleach, more sweetness, more heat. The air at my station had gone almost tropical, damp enough that my sleeves clung to my forearms under the coat. For one long moment, everything looked normal again. Still carcasses. Motionless chain. Order restored by procedure. You could have convinced yourself the night was just bad equipment and nerves. That was the false part. I saw it collapse in pieces. First, a shackle farther down the corridor turned a quarter rotation without the chain moving. Then another did the same in the opposite direction. A wet knocking sound came from under the floor, not from one point but several, staggered like something traveling beneath us through connected channels. The drain cover near my boots gave a single upward click and settled back into place. Cold mist drifted sideways across the line, though no fan had changed speed. Somewhere beyond Line C, metal banged in a rapid sequence from another section of the plant, and then another after that, as if different parts of the facility were waking up to the shutdown one by one. Jebediah lowered his radio. "You hear that?" he said. Everybody heard it. Nobody answered. Colton Rhea came onto the corridor fast, shoes slapping wet concrete. He didn't ask who'd reported the stoppage. He already knew. "Do not leave your station," he said, and for the first time his voice carried strain. "Eyes forward. Official rule number 2. Do not leave your assigned station under any circumstances." Hearing him use it then, when the power was down and the line should have been harmless, finally showed me what it was for. It wasn't about keeping people safe during a malfunction. It was about keeping people placed where the system expected them to be. The breathing started up all at once, not one breath under the machinery this time. Many. Slow draws from different depths and distances, some near the floor, some high enough that I couldn't place them, all of them damp and patient. Jebediah spun in place trying to locate the sound. I didn't. I'd learned that much. If you listened too hard, it noticed. Across from me, one of the processed units opened and closed its cavity like a mouth testing air. Then several more answered from farther down the halted line. The movement spread section by section, a neck flexing where it shouldn't, a leg pulling tight against the shackle. A row of hanging bodies twisting toward the corridor wall as if tracking motion beyond it. The worst part was that not all of them responded. Plenty stayed inert, ordinary, dead, mixed among the active ones so thoroughly you couldn't sort them by sight alone. The system was doing that sorting for us. At the time, I still thought the danger was that some processed units were alive in a way I didn't understand. The real danger was much narrower and much worse. The active ones weren't just moving, they were waiting to see who would acknowledge them. Jebediah saw it a second after I did, and instead of shutting down, he got angry. Angry was easier for him than afraid. "This is exactly why you report it," he said, too loud in the damp stillness. "They need to know something's wrong." Colton turned on him so fast the water on his apron swung out in an arc. "Nothing's wrong." That silence afterward felt bigger than the building. Because if nothing was wrong, then all of it belonged. The maximum shift in my understanding happened in a rush, with every earlier detail locking into place so quickly it almost felt like memory instead of realization. The short, unexplained stoppages, the carved warnings hidden on my panel, the movement that only came after specific temperature changes, the same marked unit appearing twice. Colton grabbing my wrist before I could tag the responsive one, Jebediah asking why they wouldn't want us to follow safety rules. I finally had the right question. The plant wasn't failing to process contaminated product. The plant was processing a mixed stream on purpose. Some of what came through the building had once been chickens, or close enough to move through intake without notice. Some of it was the other thing, the thing that had adapted itself to the line so completely it used scalding, chilling, hanging, and waste recovery as life stages. Not disguises, not infestation in the ordinary sense. Integration. A hidden ecosystem embedded in industrial routine, old enough that the machinery no longer interrupted it. The machinery supported it. Heat woke certain ones, cold woke others. Transfer points concentrated them, waste systems fed what lived below, and human inspection completed a step the machinery couldn't. Touch, attention, recognition. The active units reacted when a worker engaged with them because engagement was the final classification test. Anything that moved after processing wasn't an accident. It was waiting to see whether a human would confirm it. Official Rule 1 made workers report self-caused stoppages so the line could reset around the disturbance. Official Rule 2 kept workers pinned at known positions so the system could track them. Official Rule 3 forced human hands and eyes onto irregular units, which meant onto the active members of the hidden stream. Those weren't safety rules. They were participation instructions. The carved warnings on my panel hadn't been written by pranksters or slackers. They'd been cut there by somebody desperate enough to leave behind the only kind of help the plant wouldn't officially allow. Do nothing if the line stops on its own. Never inspect anything that moves after processing. If you hear something breathing, it is not a sign to your station. Not a better procedure manual, a survival patch. 3 breaks in the mechanism where a human being might slip free of classification. I understood one more thing too, and it made the wet air feel even smaller in my lungs. If workers were needed to sort what belonged to the ecosystem from what didn't, then the system wasn't just using us as labor, it was evaluating whether we belonged as well. A sharp, wet crack snapped me out of it. Jebediah had grabbed a moving unit by the side, either to prove it was only mechanical, or to steady it long enough to inspect properly. Even after what he'd seen, he was still trying to solve the situation by obeying the printed sheet more perfectly. The unit answered his touch immediately. Its whole body cinched inward around the grip of his glove, not like muscle contracting, more like a trap tightening around the shape that had completed it. The shackle above him jerked. Then the next one did too. Then the next. Not powered motion. Coordinated adjustment. "Colton," Jebediah said, and that was the first time I heard actual fear in him. The line around his station closed. Hooks slid together with a fast, clattering run, taking up the empty spacing that should have existed between units. Steam or cold mist, I still don't know which, burst from the transfer seam beneath him and rolled waist-high across the corridor. Jebediah gave one short grunt, more surprise than scream. I saw his face shield flash white in the glare. I saw his hand still attached to the unit. Then the moving row folded inward on itself. When the mist cleared, his station was empty. No body on the floor, no struggle, no blood. Just an occupied sequence of hooks where there should have been a gap, swaying gently as if the chain had swallowed the space he used to stand in. One of the units drifting past carried the bright orange cuff of his glove tucked halfway inside the cavity tie, like a piece of material snagged during packaging. Colton Rhea didn't go to the spot where Jebediah had been. He shut his eyes for 1 second, opened them, and looked straight at me. "Don't let it know you understand," he said. That was the closest thing to mercy anybody gave me in that building. I obeyed. Because at that point, obedience had finally become the opposite of what the printed sheet meant. I stopped inspecting, stopped tagging, stopped reaching for anything that moved or breathed or reacted to temperature change. More important, I stopped focusing on it. When an active unit flexed as it passed, I let my gaze slide over it like it was no different from the inert bodies around it. If something beneath the grating rustled near my boots, I didn't angle my head to listen. When the breathing rose from the drains, I kept my eyes on the panel seam and counted the water drops on the steel instead. The effect was immediate enough to terrify me. The active ones lost interest. Not all at once, but visibly. A neck that had begun to turn toward me settled forward again. A cavity that had flexed open stayed still when I refused to acknowledge it. The warm patches in the air moved through my station without thickening around me. It was as if the system needed a completed loop, some sign of human recognition to hold me in its logic. The moment I denied it that response, I became harder for it to place. Colton had known that, which meant he had known the real shape of the plant all along, at least enough to survive it. I still don't know whether he enforced the official rules because he was afraid, because somebody above him demanded it, Or because after enough years inside a thing like that you stop distinguishing between keeping it running and keeping yourself alive. Maybe there wasn't a difference anymore. He backed away from line C without taking his eyes off the moving hooks. Not fleeing, making himself negligible. I copied him. The maintenance lights flickered. Somewhere deeper in the plant, motors stuttered as if power was trying to return in sections. That partial reset changed the corridor, not safer, more confused. Transfer points clanged open and shut out of sequence. Fans surged on one side of the building while others stayed dead. The hidden system had lost clean alignment with the machinery, and for a few minutes neither one seemed fully sure where the other ended. That was my window. I moved when a bank of overhead lights along the next corridor snapped dark and the active units on my line turned toward the sound. Not running. Running would have made me legible. I walked the way tired workers walk at the end of bad shifts, shoulders low, pace steady, eyes on the wet floor. I left my gloves on, kept my radio clipped in place, let the line behind me clatter through its broken rhythm while the sweet, rotten smell followed just a little too close at my back. At the mouth of the corridor, I passed the metal panel with the carved warnings. Up close, with the heat from the line rolling over it, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were older scratches underneath the 3 visible lines, sanded down almost flat. More rules had been there once, maybe more people. Maybe more failed attempts to say just enough without being caught. I didn't stop to read what was left. Beyond inspection, the plant looked wrong in ways it hadn't at clock in. Transfer hooks moving in short, independent bursts. A chiller curtain billowing though no product passed through it. A drain channel carrying runoff against the slight slope of the floor. From one side room came a dense rustling that reminded me of birds settling on rafters, except it was too low, too wet, and much too heavy. Every part of the building fit the same pattern now. Not isolated anomalies. Layers. One system inside another, sharing space so tightly that ordinary production masked a biological process nobody outside would ever name. How much of what moved through that facility was part of it, I couldn't tell. That was the part that broke me later. Not what I knew, but what I couldn't possibly measure. Looking back, I think the plant counted on that. Give a man one undeniable truth and 100 uncertainties around it, and he leaves with a story nobody wants to hear, but no proof large enough to shut the place down. I reached the locker room just before dawn when the high windows had begun to gray at the edges. The air there smelled different, less chemical, more old sweat and detergent and metal warmed by bodies. Human smell. It hit me so hard I nearly sat down on the wet bench and stayed there. My hands were shaking by then, not from panic, from effort. It took work not to listen for breathing inside the walls. Jebediah Crowell's locker stood partly open. His things were still inside. Ear protectors, half a roll of paper towels, a sealed bottle of water with condensation running down it. On the locker beside his was a strip of fresh tape with no name written yet. Space for the next new hire. Pass the torch. That's the phrase I've hated ever since because it makes it sound noble. It wasn't noble. It was the smallest compromise I could live with after understanding that walking away clean was never really on offer. I took a box cutter from the bench supply tray, popped the blade, and bent over the blank locker door. The steel was cool under my glove except in one spot near the middle where it felt faintly warm, as if the building's breath had made it that far too. I carved hard and fast, deep enough that wash-down chemicals wouldn't take it right away. If the line stops on its own, do nothing. Never inspect anything that moves after processing. If you hear something breathing, it is not a sign to your station. I added nothing else, no explanation, no names, no plea to believe it. People trust rules faster than confessions. When I stepped outside, the sky over the loading yard was the color of dirty ice. Refrigerated trailers sat back to the bays with their unit fans rumbling, white vapor rolling from beneath them into the morning air. My clothes were soaked through with humidity and cold. The sweet smell of the plant clung to me so completely I couldn't tell whether it was on the fabric or in my sinuses now for good. I kept walking. Halfway across the lot, with the building behind me dark in several sections from the shutdown, I heard Line C start again. Not a generator kicking in, not general power returning. I knew those sounds by then. This was the conveyor itself, that wet mechanical hum rising into motion while whole parts of the plant still sat unpowered. A line beginning because the thing inside it had found a way to continue without the machinery pretending to lead anymore. I didn't turn around. I left the lot. I left the job. I left Arkansas a month later. And none of that put enough distance between me and what I learned in that corridor. Because the worst question never got answered for me. Not how that plant worked. I know how it worked now. Not who first wrote the official rules. Somebody had, long before I got there, somebody who understood profit and adaptation could live in the same building. What still wakes me up is the scale of it, how much of the stream was theirs, how many facilities had discovered the same balance and called it normal production. How many other inspection lines depended on workers being just curious enough to complete the sort. People think being permanently changed by something means nightmares or fear of the dark or some speech about never being the same again. Mine's smaller than that, quieter. If I go into a grocery store, I don't head straight for the freezer cases anymore. I stop first and listen to the refrigeration. Most people only hear the fan. I always wait to find out if anything underneath it is breathing.